Hi guys, so in today's video I'm going to talk to you about exposure and the exposure triangle, which involves 3 different settings that you can potentially control on your camera to give you an overall balanced picture. Now, when we talk about exposure, we're talking about how bright or how dim the image is. And I'll flash up on the screen just now an overexposed picture where it's far too bright, an underexposed picture of that same location where it's far too dark, and then a more balanced exposure where you've got a nice balance between being able to see some of the details in the shadow areas or darker areas, but also some of the details in the brighter highlight areas. So, what 3 things contribute towards your exposure? We have something called aperture, which if you saw my previous video, I explained a little bit about aperture, but I'll go into it in more detail in this one. You then have shutter speed as well, and we have ISO. I'll leave ISO till last. It's the easiest to explain, but it's the one you want to change the least, or use that as a last resort. So first off, we've got aperture. Now, aperture is how big an opening your lens has on it. The wider the aperture, or the lower the F number, the more light that's allowing into your sensor, and therefore the brighter the image will be. A narrower aperture, or a higher F number, then the smaller that hole will be, and therefore the less light will be allowed in. For shutter speed, we have a reading that is measured in seconds or fractions of a second, and the shutter speed determines how long the shutter opens up before it closes again, and while the shutter is open, the light can get shone onto the sensor, and the sensor in your camera can start to detect what the different colours are of the image that you're looking at. Obviously, the longer the shutter speed, the brighter the image is going to get, and the quicker the shutter speed, the darker the image will be. Talking a little bit about the advantages of a fast shutter speed and slow shutter speed, I'm going to try and get some practical examples where I've got some birds here that I'll hopefully be able to take a photograph of, and I've got some water as well that I'll try to capture some movement in. The final part of the exposure triangle is ISO, as I mentioned at the start, and this is responsible for how sensitive your camera sensor is to light. So the higher the ISO is, the more sensitive your sensor is to light, and the brighter the image will get, and the lower the ISO is, the less sensitive the sensor is to light, and the dimmer the image will be. Now, the reason that ISO tends to be the last thing you want to change or put up is because the higher that ISO goes, the more grain and noise you'll get in your image, and I'll try and show that to you today. Looking at a summary of those 3, that kind of helps you understand why the lenses with a wider aperture or a lower F number tend to be the more expensive ones, because what they do is they allow as much light as possible in, which means you can use a faster shutter speed and still get the same overall exposure without having to push your ISO up. For a lens that has a narrower maximum aperture, something like 3.5 is quite common in most kit lenses, they don't let nearly as much light in, and so in order to use a fast shutter speed with them and freeze any action, like a bird flying, what you have to do there is your camera will have to put the ISO up in order to get a level exposure when you're taking that picture. Okay, so looking at this first composition I've got set up, we can see that there is some rippling in the water here, but what I'm going to try and demonstrate with this composition is I'm going to use a really slow shutter speed and try and show you the benefit of what happens to a picture when you use a slow shutter speed, and that allows you to capture some movement. So hopefully the idea here will be that this water will start to smooth out and you'll get a nice little pattern in the water as a result. Conversely, if I use a really fast shutter speed and try and freeze that action, here's the image that I end up with, which shows each individual ripple in the water as well. Okay, so this first image was taken at a 6-second exposure time. So what that means is the shutter opened up for 6 seconds and let light continuously burn onto the sensor in order to produce this image, where you can see a nice little reflection of the clouds in the little sort of pond of water here, and it's also smoothed out the water a wee bit as well. If we compare that to the image with the faster shutter speed, which is 1/400th of a second, you can probably see, I can't see on the back of my camera screen here, but you can probably see the difference there, where you can actually see the ripples a little bit more with that one, and maybe the reflection won't be quite as good. Now, in order to do that, I had to put one of these onto the end of my lens. This is a filter, an ND filter, and basically that acts as sunglasses for the lens, and it prevents as much light getting through. And what that's done is it has allowed me to use that long shutter speed, the 6-second exposure. If I didn't use that ND filter, my aperture would have closed down as much as it could to f/22, and the ISO would have gone as low as possible, both of those factors limiting as much light as possible getting in. But at 6 seconds there's still far too much light getting in, and it would have resulted in a burnt out image that I'll show you on screen now. So you can see here, without using the ND filter, having a 6-second exposure is far too long for the camera to cope with, and it's ended up with a completely blown out image where we've lost a lot of detail. Okay, one other thing that's worth mentioning, that what I did there was I used a tripod for those long exposure shots where the shutter speed was open for 6 seconds. The reason the tripod's really important there is that ensures that the camera stays completely still and you don't get any blur in your image by you trying to hold your camera still for 6 seconds. The other thing I did was I went into the drive mode on the camera and changed it to the 2-second timer. And what that does is it means I can hit the button and then it'll take 2 seconds before it starts to take the picture. So that means I can take my fingers off the shutter and ensure the camera's not budging at all while it's taking that photograph. Now, I'm looking for some birds so that I can go and show you where a faster shutter speed is really helpful for creating an image. Right, there's some birds over the other side of the pier here, so just as I'm walking over, I'll tell you what I'm going to do here. I'm going to change lens over from my 28 to 75 over to my 7-8-200, and what that's going to allow me to do is get much more reach and get a lot closer to the birds I'm trying to photograph. There's one there. Get a lot closer to them so that we can get a better picture of them. However, the negative of changing over to my longer lens is that the aperture on it only goes down to f4 as opposed to f2.8 on that previous lens I was using. Now what that means is when it comes to trying to get a fast shutter speed to freeze the bird and get it caught in flight with no blur, that means that my ISO is going to have to go higher in order to get that balanced exposure. We'll see how it turns out. I am running out of light today, so this will be quite an interesting one to show you the effect ISO can have on your image as well. Okay, so I've got the long lens on, the 7-8-200. Now this one's only an f4, so it doesn't let as much light in. I'm going to go into shutter priority mode and try and get a few snaps of a few birds, and I'll talk you through what effect the different shutter speeds will have on the image that you get. Okay, so this one up on screen I've got just now was taken at f4 and 1/1000th of a second, and that was to try, that fast shutter speed is going to make sure that that bird's flapping its wings gets frozen in flight. The ISO there I have set on auto as well. The camera's going to take care of that, and it's only gone up to 160, which means there won't be that much noise, so I've still got plenty of light in order to get that fast shutter speed. But let's suppose I didn't have that fast shutter speed, or I didn't have the light available. What would happen if I put the shutter speed much lower? Let's try and get a shot like that and have a look at what effect a slower shutter speed has. Okay, got a couple of great examples there where the birds flew quite close to me, and looking at these you can see that this was taken at 1/100th of a second compared to the previous one at 1/1000th. Because of the light that's available, the camera has then calculated f8 as the aperture and has kept the ISO at 100 as well. And from this shutter speed you can see that there's some motion blur in the flapping of the bird's wings, and that's because that shutter speed is not fast enough to freeze that motion, so I've ended up with a blurry wing on the bird. Okay, so I've got one more image here to show you, and this is where having a fast aperture lens or a wide aperture lens can be really handy for doing action photography or something where you need that high shutter speed. If your lens only goes to say 5.6 or 6.3 on the f number and the aperture doesn't open up as much, it's not going to let as much light in. Now if you then program in a really fast shutter speed, the camera's going to have to bump the ISO up in order to compensate and still get that level exposure. So I put my camera into manual mode and plugged the aperture in at 6.3, put the shutter speed as fast as I could, just to then get the ISO as high as it would go. And this image here was taken at 1/8000th of a second, so a really, really fast shutter speed. Aperture was 6.3, and that caused the camera to put the ISO at 25,600. Now looking at that picture, the quality of it is quite poor, because what's happened is that ISO results in a lot more grain in the image. Whereas if we jumped back to where we had the one at f4, because that aperture lets in a lot more light, the ISO didn't have to go as high, and therefore the image was a lot cleaner and had a lot less noise in it than that last picture. So what we've covered today, guys, should give you hopefully a little bit more information about shutter speed and how that can affect your image, and when you might want to use a fast shutter speed for action stuff, or if something's moving really fast, and when you might want to use a slower shutter speed for a long exposure picture. The three factors all work together to basically give you a level exposure. Now I'll put up on screen just now an image that will summarise what hopefully you've learned about each of those three values, where if you've got a very wide aperture or a very high ISO or a very slow shutter speed, those three factors will all create a much brighter image on the whole, whereas a very narrow aperture, a very fast shutter speed, and a very low ISO, those three factors would create a much darker image. What your camera does when it's in any of the auto modes or semi-automatic modes is it will calculate what the other factors need to be, or each of those factors need to be, in order to get a balanced exposure. You can put your camera in aperture priority mode, which is where you control the aperture, and the camera then calculates what the ISO would need to be and what the shutter speed would need to be in order to get a balanced exposure. Because ISO tends to be the worst one to have to increase, the camera will increase that last. So it'll set a shutter speed as slow as possible if you're in aperture priority, that will then allow an ISO to be set that creates that balanced exposure without pushing the ISO too high. If you're in shutter priority mode, you select the shutter speed, the camera will then select the aperture, and then the ISO accordingly as well. Generally it'll put the aperture as low as it can in order to keep the ISO at 100 or thereabouts. It might bump the ISO up a little bit and go with something at like 5.6 for the aperture, depending on the lens you've got. Whereas if you want full control, you would need to go over into manual mode, where you can set all three, or you can do what I tend to do, is put the ISO in automatic when you're in manual mode, and you can then set the aperture that you want and the shutter speed that you want and let the camera dictate the ISO accordingly. For me, that just allows you to be a little bit quicker in taking your photograph, but it still gives you that full control over, do I want a long shutter speed here? Do I want to freeze the action? Do I want that blurry background? Do I want everything in focus? Those 4 questions, you can answer them quite quickly, and the camera will then set the ISO instead of you having to set a third variable as well. One final thing that's worth mentioning is different cameras, their sensors will be able to cope with different levels of ISOs a little bit better. A really top-end camera can cope with ISOs up to maybe 12,000 thereabouts, whereas a cheaper camera that's maybe a bit older now might struggle above ISO 6400 or even 3200, where you start to get a lot of that grain and noise in the image. So go out, experiment with your camera, find that ISO point that is too much noise for your liking, and then that way you'll know when you're taking your picture, if you see the camera ISO go above that, you'll know, right, maybe I need to change one of my other settings in order to not have the ISO go that high. Quite a long one today, guys. Hopefully that's helped explain a little bit more about shutter speed, certainly, and when you might want to use what type of shutter speed, and also an element of that full manual control and being able to come up with your own exposure based on those 3 settings that each contribute towards a balanced exposure. Once again, if there's any questions, just leave a comment and I'll get back to you as soon as I can.